She has been refreshing her inbox every few minutes since the interview, her pulse jumping each time the screen lit up. The hiring manager had called her the top candidate, and she had let herself build a quiet, bright future on those words. When the rejection finally loads, the silence that fills the room is not just quiet. It is a heavy physical weight. Yet 3 weeks later, a similar rejection arrives for a job she never really wanted, and she deletes it without a second thought. The objective event is nearly identical, but the emotional aftershock lands in two completely different worlds. Why does the exact same disappointment carve a hollow into your chest one day and barely scratch the surface another? The most immediate answer seems obvious. The pain is simply the gap between what you expected and what you got. High hope creates a long fall, and zero hope leaves almost no room to drop. That arithmetic makes sense, but it only describes the surface of the wound without explaining why the bruise feels so deep. To understand why disappointment stings more after high expectations, you have to look underneath the expectation itself. An expectation is not a cool intellectual forecast. It is a whole-body preparation for a future your brain has already started to accept. Your brain has an ancient, finely tuned accounting system that tracks predictions and compares them with reality moment by moment. When something unexpectedly good happens, those same signals spike sharply upward, creating a wave of pleasure and surprise. But when you brace for a bright outcome and the door slams shut, the brain's pleasure signal does not just stay quiet. This dip is not a flaw. It is a crucial learning signal that tells your brain to update its predictions for next time. The problem is that this biological update process can feel remarkably similar to physical pain in its early raw moments. You are not just thinking that something good did not happen. Your body is experiencing a sudden withdrawal from a future it had already tasted. Now return to that job applicant in the quiet room, and you can see that her suffering is more than a math problem. Her brain had already released anticipatory signals that painted images of a new office, a proud phone call, and a different daily routine. Human beings do not passively wait for the future. We simulate it vividly, and those simulations can feel almost as real as the present moment. Neuroscience shows that imagining a positive event can activate many of the same brain regions that fire when the event actually occurs. This means that when an expected reward vanishes, you are not just losing a possibility, you are abandoning a reality your brain had started to inhabit. The larger and more detailed the future you built, the more mental furniture you now have to dismantle in the fecensolence after the bad news. This is why a generic hope that things might work out feels less crushing to lose than a specific, richly painted daydream. The job candidate did not just lose a position. She lost a whole parallel life that she had unknowingly begun to live. There is also a social geometry to this pain that amplifies the internal shock. When your high expectations were shared by people around you, the disappointment becomes a public unraveling. You have to not only manage your own sadness, but also perform the role of the person who failed front of a sympathetic but watching crowd. The gap between the public prediction and the private defeat can feel like a loss of face, even if everyone is kind about the outcome. The disappointment then gets layered with embarrassment, and the emotional cocktail becomes much harder to swallow than the solitary letdown. This social dimension also explains why a rejection for a job you never told anyone about hurts so much less. The imagined future had no witnesses. Beyond the social mirror, the weight of your own effort plays a silent but enormous role in how deep the disappointment cuts. The more time, energy, identity, and sacrifice you invested, the higher the expectation naturally grew. You did not just hope. You worked, you rehearsed, you changed your schedule, and you let the goal become a central pillar of your immediate future. When that pillar is kicked out, the collapse is not only about the missed outcome, but also about the sudden meaninglessness of all that invested effort. The mind asks a desperate question in the aftermath. What was all that sacrifice for if it led to the same destination as never trying at all? This retroactive rewriting of the past can make the rejection feel not just disappointing, but actively unjust. High expectations also set the stage for a particular kind of mental spiral called counterfactual thinking. Counterfactual thinking is the imagination's attempt to rewrite the past by asking what-if questions. What if I had answered the last interview question differently? What if I had sent the follow-up email sooner? What if I had smiled less? When the expectation was high, the counterfactual scenarios multiply because you were so close to the imagined victory. A narrow miss after immense hope generates a factory of alternative realities, and each one of them becomes a sharp, invisible blade. The brain replays the tape not to help you suffer, but because it is trying to extract a lesson from a prediction error that was surprisingly large. Unfortunately, this replay often traps you in a loop of self-blame, where the gap between expectation and outcome gets filled with personal failure. What started as a simple hope for a job gradually transforms into a verdict about your competence, your worth, and your intelligence. The story of a specific disappointment becomes confused with a story about a whole self, and that emotional weight is much harder to carry. This is the moment where a healthy calibration of future predictions tips over into a painful and often inaccurate identity conclusion. The brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. It is mapping a serious surprise so that you can survive better next time. But the cost of this mapping is that you must first pass through a low, dark valley where the loss of the expectation feels permanent. It is important to pause here and recognize that not everyone rides the same roller coaster after high hopes collapse. Some people protect themselves by never building bright, elaborate futures. They keep their expectations deliberately low to avoid the fall. This strategy can reduce the sting of disappointment, but it often comes with a quiet, lingering cost of its own. Chronic under-expectation can drain the color from daily life and prevent the very risks that lead to meaningful change and connection. The goal is never to abandon hope, because hope is the engine of future-directed effort and a source of deep resilience. The real challenge is to learn how to hold a bright hope in one hand while keeping the other hand open to an uncertain world. Now we can return to the job candidate once more, because she eventually noticed something important about her own pattern. She realized that the acute physical pain she felt was not just about the lost salary or the lost title. The real agony pulsed from the sudden disappearance of a person she had already allowed herself to become in her private thoughts. She was not merely disappointed. She was in miniature mourning for a self that had existed only in her imagination. This is the quiet reversal that changes everything about why high expectations hurt so much. The pain is proportional not just to the height of your hope, but to the vividness of the imagined identity you had already started to wear. When that identity is torn away without notice, you do not just lose a job. You lose the respected, successful, secure version of you that you had already met. The disappointment hurts more because you are grieving a ghost, a perfectly constructed self that died before it could draw its first real breath. This grief is real even though its object was never physically present, because the neurological and emotional signature is nearly identical. Your brain does not clearly distinguish between a strongly simulated future and a factual memory in terms of the emotional charge it carries. That is why the hollow in your chest feels so much like true bereavement. In a very real neural sense, you are experiencing a loss. The original dramatic question was why this same disappointment can feel so different. And now the answer has shifted. The identical external event matters less than the elaborate internal universe you had constructed around the expectation. A small hope yields a small phantom self, quickly dissolved, whereas a towering hope yields a detailed, beloved phantom whose absence echoes. This insight does not remove the sting, but it changes where you can aim your awareness the next time you feel hope rising. You can start to notice when a simple desire is quietly transforming into an assumed future with consequences for your self-worth. The moment you spot that transformation, you can begin to separate what you want from who you are without killing the wanting itself. This is the earned release that comes after understanding the true mechanism of disappointment. Walking through the world with high expectations is not a sign of foolishness. It is a marker of a mind that can still paint vivid pictures of better alternatives. The task is not to stop painting those pictures, but to remember that the painting is a guide, not a contract with reality. When reality tears the painting, you will still feel the grief, but you may not be so quick to conclude that the painter is worthless. You can feel the drop in your brain's pleasure signal without letting that chemical trough define your entire identity for the next month. The job applicant cannot undo the rejection, but she can later say to herself, "I am hurting because I dared to build a beautiful future, not because I am a failure." That single shift in narrative puts the pain back where it belongs, in the gap between prediction and outcome, not in a verdict about a permanent self. The disappointment is real, the biological withdrawal is measurable, but the meaning you assign to that pain is still open for gentle revision. One of the most respectful things you can do for yourself after a high hope collapses is to pause before writing the final story of what the loss says about you. The quiet room after the rejection email is still quiet, but the heavy silence no longer needs to sound like a pronouncement of your limits. It can sound instead like the brief, painful pause where an old prediction falls away and a more accurate map of the world begins to form. That pause is uncomfortable, and no psychological insight will turn it into a pleasant experience, but a little understanding can make it bearable. You do not have to retreat into cynicism, or never let yourself want anything again in order to protect yourself from the fall. You can simply practice holding your hopes as vivid, cherished possibilities rather than impending certainties. When you catch yourself mentally living in a future that has not been promised, you can gently remind yourself that the present moment still holds your real life. This practice does not make you unbreakable, but it can shrink the distance between the high perch of expectation and the solid ground of reality. A shorter fall is easier to stand up from, and the standing up becomes a familiar skill rather than a sudden crisis. As for the woman who lost the job she desperately wanted, she eventually learned to hope again, though her hopes carried a new, quiet spaciousness. She still interviews, still imagines bright outcomes, still lets herself picture the office and the team and the satisfying first month. But she now holds those images with the same care you would hold a bird that can fly away at any moment without becoming your entire sky. That spaciousness allows her to absorb a no with a sharper, cleaner pain that passes more cleanly instead of poisoning her sense of self. The high expectation still raises the stakes, and the disappointment still hurts, but the pain no longer owns the story of who she is becoming. She understands now that the ache is evidence of her courageous capacity to build futures, not evidence of some fundamental flaw in her character. And that understanding changes the tone of the silence after the next rejection, turning it from a tomb into a brief, restorative pause. High expectations make disappointment hurt more because they build a temporary home for your future self, and the heart always grieves when a home is lost.